She screamed, but the earth swallowed her voice. Buried alive with her newborn, Grace clawed at the coffin lid as her baby's cry pierced the soil. Everyone thought she was gone. But the dead don't stay silent forever. The moon hung low over the village, blood red against the sky. In a quiet hut at the edge of the compound, Grace held her newborn son close to her chest. His cries were soft, weak, yet filled with the kind of power that shook a mother's heart. She had named him David after the ancient king who rose from nothing to greatness. But Grace's peace was fragile. Across the courtyard, Linda, her husband's second wife, sat watching. Jealousy burned in her eyes. Grace's child had drawn all the blessings, all the praise, and all of Michael's attention. The women at the well whispered that David was a child of destiny, born with fortune in his cries. To Linda, those whispers were poison. Michael, blind to the war between his wives, smiled proudly as he welcomed visitors. "My son will bring light to this house," he said. He never noticed Linda's clenched fists. That night, as the drums of celebration faded, the compound fell silent. Grace rocked David to sleep, unaware that Linda stood in the shadows, whispering to herself, "If the baby lives, I am nothing. If Grace stays, I will never rise." Linda's jealousy grew into something darker, something that no longer felt human. She had begun visiting an old woman at the edge of the forest, a spiritualist with hollow eyes, and a voice like wind through a graveyard. Grace lay in her bed, exhausted from childbirth, cradling her son. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it a faint, chilling whisper. And then, David cried, not the cry of hunger, not the cry of discomfort. It was a cry that echoed beyond the walls of the hut, a cry that even the dead could hear. The night air turned heavy. Even the crickets stopped their song as David's wail rang through the compound. The elders in their huts stirred uneasily. A baby's cry was natural, but this sound carried weight, like a summons no one could resist. Grace tried to soothe him, pressing him gently to her chest, whispering lullabies taught to her by her mother. But David's little body trembled, his fists clenched tight, as if he were wrestling with forces unseen. In the next hut, Michael sat upright, his smile from earlier fading into confusion. "Why does the child cry like that?" he muttered. He stood, hesitated, then sat back down, unaware that his second wife was already moving silently through the shadows. Linda pressed herself against the mud wall, her nails digging into her palms. Each cry from David felt like a slap across her face, mocking her barrenness, mocking her place in Michael's house. She remembered the words of the old woman at the forest's edge. The child of destiny must be silenced before he grows. His cry is a beacon. It calls spirits, both light and dark. If you want to rise, you must bury the cry. Bury the cry. Linda's heart pounded with the words. Tonight, it was not just jealousy, it was fear. Fear that this child would outshine her forever. Fear that her name would fade while Grace became the mother of a legend. David's wailing grew sharper, louder. Grace, exhausted, rocked harder, humming prayers instead of songs now. But the baby's eyes, tiny, dark, glistening, stared past her as if he were looking at something behind her shoulder, something only he could see. Grace froze. Slowly she turned her head. The corner of the hut was empty, only shadows, and yet the air was colder there, thick as if someone was standing just out of sight. Her breath caught. "No weapon formed against me shall prosper," she whispered, clutching David tighter. The baby's cries softened for a heartbeat, as though he too listened to her words. Outside, Linda trembled. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to stop listening to the voice in her head, urging her on, but then she heard Michael's low chuckle in his hut, soft, proud, happy. Happy because of Grace. That was the spark. Her jealousy burned into resolve. She crept back into the shadows, her mind already racing toward the forest, toward the old woman who had promised her a way. Inside the hut, Grace rocked her child until his cries faded into hiccups, and finally, sleep. But her heart refused to rest. She felt it in her bones. The night was not finished with her. And beyond the compound, in the darkness of the forest, a pair of hollow eyes opened. The spiritualist had heard the cry too. The ancestors had been stirred. The next morning, whispers filled the compound. Women at the well spoke of the strange cry that had echoed through the night. Some said it was a blessing, that the child's voice reached even the ears of the ancestors. Others lowered their voices, saying a cry like that could awaken spirits that should remain at rest. Grace tried to smile through the chatter, but her eyes were heavy, her body weak. She had not fully healed from childbirth, and sleepless nights gnawed at her strength. Still, she carried David proudly, humming softly as he blinked at the morning sun. Linda watched from the doorway, her jealousy hardening into something sharper than steel. Each time Michael reached to hold the baby, each time a villager blessed Grace with gifts of grain or milk, Linda's chest burned hotter. That evening, Linda slipped away. The forest swallowed her steps as she reached the old woman's hut. A fire burned low in the center, its smoke rising in slow, heavy coils. "You heard the cry?" the old woman rasped without turning. Her eyes were white, clouded with age and something not of this world. Linda shivered. "Yes, it calls attention. They say he is a child of destiny. And destiny," the old woman croaked, "can be broken if the mother is silenced. Bury her voice, and the child's light will dim." Linda hesitated. Her hands shook. What must I do? The old woman leaned forward, her hollow gaze locking on Linda. "When the moon is hidden, strike. A woman fresh from birth is weak. She will not resist. Take her to the earth and bury her alive. The child will follow her into silence. No one will ever know Linda's breath caught." The thought of killing Grace chilled her to the marrow, but the thought of Grace living, thriving, glowing while she herself faded into nothingness, chilled her more. That night, she sharpened her resolve. Grace, exhausted, fell into deep sleep beside David. Michael, believing the house at peace, left to drink palm wine with the other men. Linda stood in the shadows, the moon covered by drifting clouds. In her hand, a rope twisted like a snake. Her lips moved in whispers learned from the old woman, words that tasted of ash. "Tonight," she breathed, "her voice will be swallowed." And with the silence of a predator, she stepped into Grace's hut. The night was heavy, cloaked in silence. Even the crickets seemed to hush, as though the earth itself knew what was about to happen. Grace stirred in her sleep. David's tiny body curled against her chest. A mother's instincts prickled, her spirit whispering that danger hovered close, but exhaustion weighed her down. Suddenly, hands gripped her throat. Grace's eyes flew open. In the dim glow of the oil lamp, she saw Linda's face, twisted with fury. "Linda, why—" Grace tried to cry out, but the rope cut her words short. David wailed, his cry splitting the night like a blade. "Be quiet," Linda hissed, her voice shaking as though she were fighting her own conscience. But jealousy gave her strength. She dragged Grace from the bed, the baby still clutched in her arms, and pulled them into the dark. The village slept, unaware. The path to the forest was long, but Linda's rage carried her forward. She reached a clearing where the soil was loose and damp from recent rain. Her hands trembled, but she dug. The earth opened under her like a hungry mouth. Grace, weak and gasping, clutched David tighter. "Linda, please, think of what you're doing. I never wished you harm," but Linda's eyes blazed. You stole everything. Michael's love, the villagers' praise, everything that should have been mine. Grace struggled, her wrists bound, David crying in her arms. The child's voice echoed through the trees, shrill and unrelenting. "Linda, stop this," Grace begged. "He's your blood too. Do not curse yourself." But Linda's heart had hardened like stone. Jealousy had eaten her alive, and now it demanded a sacrifice. Grace's cries turned to prayers, whispered pleas to the ancestors. She kissed David's forehead and held him close, but Linda shoved them both into the pit. The soil was cold against Grace's skin. The child screamed, muffled beneath the dirt that rained down. Grace's lungs filled with earth. Her arms weakened. She tried to push upward to save her son, but Linda stamped the ground down with her heel. "Stay buried," Linda hissed. Her voice cracked like brittle wood, but her rage kept her firm. The cries of the baby grew weaker. Grace's last thought was of Michael, the man she loved, the home she had built, the life stolen from her. Then, silence. Only the sound of Linda's breathing, ragged and haunted, remained. She staggered back to the village, her clothes soiled, her ears ringing. But even as she tried to rest that night, the phantom cries of a baby echoed in her mind. She pressed her hands to her ears. It did not stop. When Grace and her baby, David, did not return the following morning, unease gripped the village like a sudden storm. Michael searched every path and riverbank, his sandals tearing against stones as he cried out their names until his throat bled. Grace. David. But the only answer was the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. By evening, villagers gathered at Michael's compound, their faces pale with fear and curiosity. Linda, draped in a shawl, pressed trembling hands to her face. She was unhappy here, she murmured. Perhaps she left, with the child. Perhaps she could not bear it. Michael's head jerked toward her, his eyes red and wild. Grace would not abandon me, not without a word, not with David so small. But the villagers muttered among themselves. A woman wronged may run, a new mother might flee into the night. The whispers spread like fire through dry grass, and though no one spoke it aloud, suspicion stirred in their hearts. Days turned into weeks. Michael stopped eating, stopped smiling, stopped living. He walked the village like a ghost, torn between anger and despair. But Linda could not rest. At first, she thought she had succeeded. She smiled too sweetly, laughed too loudly, and walked among the people as though unburdened. Yet every sideways glance pierced her chest. Every hushed whisper sounded like accusation. Days passed, and Linda tried to live as though nothing had happened. She smiled at the villagers, cooked meals, even lay beside Michael at night. But sleep never came easily. Each time her eyes closed, she heard it, the baby's cry, sometimes faint, sometimes deafening, always coming from beneath the ground. "Linda?" Michael asked one night, noticing her trembling. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she lied, though her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the bowl she was carrying. But the truth stalked her. The sound followed her everywhere, at the well, in the market, even in the laughter of other children. The guilt gnawed at her mind, turning the world into a prison. Then one evening, as she walked through the forest, she froze. By the clearing where she had dug the grave, the earth was broken. A mound had risen, as though something or someone had pushed upward from below. Her breath caught, and standing there, half shadow and half flesh, was Grace. Her eyes glowed pale like the moon, her skin streaked with soil, her presence heavy with death. In her arms, she carried David, alive and silent, his eyes wide and knowing. "You thought the earth would keep me." Grace's voice was both human and unearthly, but the ancestors heard my cry. "They carried me back to finish what you began." Linda stumbled backward, her scream lodged in her throat. She ran, but the sound of Grace's footsteps followed her, steady and slow. From that night on, Linda's torment deepened. She saw Grace everywhere, in the fire's smoke, in the reflection of water, in the corners of her hut. Her food turned to ash in her mouth. Her hair began to fall. The villagers whispered, "Linda is losing her mind." And then came the nights. The first time, it was a faint cry, David's cry, drifting into her hut. She sat up, clutching her chest, her eyes darting to the empty corner where no cradle lay. The second time, she saw Grace standing at the edge of the firelight, pale, silent. Her eyes glowed with sorrow and rage. "Michael!" Linda screamed, pointing into the night. "She's there. She's come back." Michael rushed out, but the clearing was empty, only the crickets singing in the dark. He gripped her by the shoulders. "Enough, Linda. Grace is gone. You must stop tormenting us both." But Linda knew what she had seen. She knew what she had heard. Every night the visions grew stronger. Grace's whispers slithered through the air. "You buried me, but I rise. You silenced me, but my cry will not die." Linda's skin grew pale, her eyes hollow. She stumbled through the village, muttering to herself. The children mocked her. The elders watched her with wary eyes. Michael avoided her touch, for she reeked of guilt and madness. One night, as the moon hung blood-red over the village, the cries grew unbearable. They rose from the earth, from beneath her floor, from the walls of her hut. Linda clawed at her ears, screaming, "Stop! Stop! Please! Grace, forgive me!" The villagers rushed to her, but when they tried to calm her, she broke free and ran, toward the old field, the place of her crime. There, by the shallow grave where she had buried Grace and David, Linda fell to her knees. She dug at the soil with bare hands, shrieking, "Take them back! Take them back!" The villagers stood frozen in horror as the truth spilled from her lips, her own tongue betraying her. Michael staggered forward, trembling. His voice cracked. You killed them." And in that moment, a cold wind swept across the field. The earth trembled and a cry, David's cry, echoed once more. Linda's scream tore through the night. Her body collapsed upon the soil, lifeless, her eyes wide with terror. Michael dropped to his knees, weeping. The villagers crossed themselves, whispering prayers. From that day, none doubted it. Grace had returned. She had avenged herself, and her cry would never die, carried forever by the wind through the village. And that brings us to the chilling end of Grace and Linda's tale. A story of jealousy, betrayal, and a cry that refused to be silenced. In every African village, the earth remembers, and the spirits never forget. What did you think of the story? Do you believe Grace truly returned, or was Linda destroyed by her own guilt? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale from enchanted African realms, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another haunting story.